The strange thing about ending a war is that sometimes it begins with a voice. The first thing Ethan Cole noticed when the shuttle doors opened was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that felt like the entire room was holding its breath. The Royal Conclave Hall stretched nearly 200 feet across, its vaulted ceiling glowing with soft blue light that rippled through crystal arches like slow-moving water. Alien guards lined the polished floor in perfect symmetry, their silver armor reflecting the pale glow of the chamber. Beyond them, through towering windows nearly 30 feet tall, the blackness of space shimmered with distant starlight and the faint silhouettes of waiting warships. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Every one of those vessels carried enough firepower to turn cities into dust, and every captain out there was waiting for one signal. Ethan stepped forward slowly, the faint hum of the chamber vibrating beneath his boots. His job was simple on paper. Broker peace between humanity and the Valar Empire before a misunderstanding turned into a war no one could afford. He had done this before. Negotiations, tense rooms, angry leaders. But none of those rooms had ever felt like this. At the far end of the hall, raised on a wide platform carved from dark iridescent stone, stood the throne of the alien queen, Queen Valyra. Even from 100 feet away, she commanded the space as if gravity itself bent toward her. Her skin carried the deep sapphire tone of a twilight ocean, smooth and luminous beneath the chamber lights. A crown grown from living crystal curved gently above her silver hair, catching the light in quiet sparks. When Ethan had studied diplomatic briefings, they described her as intelligent, cautious, and fiercely protective of her empire. None of those reports mentioned the strange calm in her posture, the stillness of someone who had already survived storms others could not imagine. Ethan stopped at the center mark on the floor, exactly where the protocol officers had instructed him. 20 feet away stood the Royal Guard. 40 feet beyond them, the Queen watched him with steady silver eyes that reflected the starfield outside the windows. He inhaled once, slow and steady. His voice needed to be clear, neutral, controlled, the kind of voice that could cross a battlefield and still sound human. Your Majesty, Ethan began, the sound carrying through the vast chamber. I come on behalf of Earth to broker peace. For half a second nothing happened. Then the Queen stood. Not slowly, not ceremonially. Instantly, the movement rippled through the hall like a shockwave. The guard stiffened. Advisors shifted. The quiet murmur of translators flickered through hidden speakers. But Valyra didn't look at them. Her eyes stayed locked on Ethan. Her expression had changed in a way none of the diplomats had prepared for. Not anger, not suspicion, recognition. She took one step down from the throne platform, her gaze narrowing as if she were listening to something only she could hear. When she spoke, her voice was softer than the translators expected, but it carried across the entire chamber. That voice, she said slowly. The words seemed to freeze the air itself. Ethan felt a strange tightening in his chest, a distant memory brushing the edge of his mind like a signal half lost in static. The Queen descended another step. I know that voice, she said. And suddenly the room that was supposed to prevent a war felt like the place where a forgotten story had just returned. The chamber did not breathe again after the Queen spoke those words. Ethan remained exactly where he stood, boots planted on the circular inlay at the center of the polished floor, because protocol said that was what a Terran envoy should do when a sovereign ruler addressed them. But inside his chest something had shifted. It was the way she said it. Not as an accusation. Not as a challenge. As if she had just found a sound she had been searching for across years of silence. Around the hall the alien advisors began whispering in low voices, their translators murmuring softly through hidden speakers. The royal guards did not move, but their posture changed just enough that Ethan noticed. Every eye in the room was now on the Queen. Queen Valyra descended another step from the platform, her movements slow and deliberate now, the way a person walks when they are not entirely certain the ground beneath them is real. The living crystal crown above her silver hair shimmered faintly as she tilted her head, studying Ethan with an intensity that felt strangely personal. Ethan forced himself to remain calm. He had spent 15 years in diplomacy training to control his breathing in rooms exactly like this one. Negotiation halls, treaty chambers, conference tables where one wrong sentence could collapse months of fragile trust. But none of those rooms had ever involved a queen who looked at him like a ghost had just spoken. He cleared his throat gently, careful not to raise his voice. "Your Majesty," he said again, steady and respectful. "If I have spoken out of turn, that was not my intention. I came only to open dialogue." The translators repeated his words in the Valar language with smooth mechanical precision. But Valyra did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped fully off the throne platform, the soft sound of her ceremonial boots touching the crystal floor echoing through the hall. Gasps rippled through the gathered court. Ethan did not need the briefing documents to know what that meant. The Queen of the Valar Empire did not descend from her throne during formal diplomacy. It simply was not done. Yet here she was, walking toward him across nearly 40 feet of open floor, while an entire royal court watched in stunned silence. Her silver eyes never left his face. Ethan felt a flicker of confusion growing into something sharper. Recognition tugged at the edge of his memory, the same way a half-remembered song sometimes surfaced when you heard the first note again. It made no sense. He had never stood in this hall before. He had never met the queen of an alien empire. Yet something about the way she moved, the quiet confidence in her stride, felt strangely familiar. She stopped 10 feet in front of him, close enough now that Ethan could see faint patterns in her blue skin, delicate lines that shimmered like reflections on deep water. Up close, she seemed taller than he expected, easily 6 feet 3 inches, her presence calm but powerful in a way that did not need to be announced. The queen studied him for several long seconds. Then she spoke again, this time more quietly. "Say something else," she said. Ethan blinked once. "Your Majesty?" She did not look away. "Anything," Valyra said softly. The room had gone so quiet that Ethan could hear the distant hum of the orbital station rotating above the planet below. Slowly, carefully, he obeyed. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said. "I represent the Terran Diplomatic Council." The moment the words left his mouth, the queen closed her eyes briefly, as if confirming something she had already begun to suspect. When she opened them again, the expression there was unmistakable: relief, astonishment, and something deeper that Ethan could not yet name. 10 years, she whispered. The translators hesitated before repeating it. "For 10 years I wondered if that voice belonged to someone real." Ethan felt the memory hit him all at once like a signal breaking through static. A long night shift in a communications bay. An emergency channel crackling through interference. A frightened voice on the other side of space asking if anyone could hear her. His heartbeat slowed. "Wait," Ethan said quietly. And suddenly the peace negotiation felt like the least important reason he had come here. The memory did not arrive gently. It came like a signal returning after years of silence. Ethan stood motionless in the center of the royal hall while fragments of that distant night rearranged themselves inside his mind. A communications bay on a Terran listening station. Dim lights. The soft glow of monitors. The quiet hours of a long shift that most officers considered uneventful. 10 years ago, he had not been a diplomat. He had been a communications specialist stationed nearly 300,000 miles from the nearest colony, listening to emergency frequencies that rarely carried anything but static. Until one voice had broken through. At the time, it had been faint and distorted, buried beneath interference and cosmic noise. A frightened voice asking a simple question over and over again. "Is anyone there?" Ethan had almost missed it. The signal strength had barely registered above background radiation. But something in the tone had made him stop adjusting the receiver. He had leaned closer to the console and spoken into the microphone. "Yes, I hear you." The reply had come several seconds later, delayed by distance and interference. Relief. Pure relief carried through a damaged transmission line. The memory was so vivid now that Ethan could almost hear the old equipment humming around him again. Back then he had not known who was on the other end of the channel. The voice had refused to identify itself at first. It had simply asked him to keep talking. "Just talk," the voice had said, as if silence itself were the most dangerous thing in the universe. Ethan had done exactly that. For hours he had stayed on that frequency, guiding the unknown pilot through simple procedures that might stabilize a failing navigation system, explaining how to conserve energy, how to reroute power, how to keep calm when instruments began reporting numbers that no one wanted to see. He had never seen her face. He had never even learned her name. Only the voice. and the way it gradually changed from fear to determination as the night continued. The queen stood only a few feet away now, watching him with quiet certainty as the realization finished unfolding across his expression. Around them, the royal court remained frozen in confusion, unsure whether they were witnessing diplomacy or something far stranger. Ethan slowly exhaled. "The rescue channel," he said softly, almost to himself. Valeira nodded once. "You stayed on the frequency for 6 hours," she said, "even when my signal weakened." The translators repeated her words, though their mechanical tone could not capture the emotion beneath them. Ethan felt the strange weight of that memory settle into place. 6 hours had not felt extraordinary at the time. It had simply been his job. Someone had called for help, and he had answered. That was all. Yet hearing the queen describe it now made the moment feel larger than he remembered. "I thought the transmission ended because the signal failed," Ethan said quietly. "I assumed the ship lost power." Valeira studied him for a moment before replying. "The signal did not fail," she said. "My vessel entered a protected corridor of space that blocked communication. When the interference cleared, your channel was gone." Ethan frowned slightly. "My shift ended. The next officer probably switched frequencies." The queen's expression softened in a way that no advisor in the room had likely seen before. "For 10 years I wondered why the voice disappeared," she said. The silence around them deepened again, but now it felt different. Less like tension, more like the moment when two distant stories finally connected. Ethan looked at the queen and realized something that none of the diplomatic briefings had prepared him for. The person he had guided through the darkness of space a decade earlier had not been a stranded pilot. It had been the future ruler of an empire. And suddenly the peace negotiation waiting outside the windows felt far more personal than any treaty. The silence that followed did not belong in a royal court. It belonged in the quiet space between two people who had just realized their lives had crossed long before this moment. Ethan could feel the attention of the entire chamber pressing against his back like a physical weight. Advisors shifted uneasily. Translators hummed as they processed each word with careful precision. Yet none of them truly understood what had just been uncovered. To them, it was a strange coincidence. To Ethan, it felt like the universe had quietly folded two distant points in time together. Queen Valeira studied him with an expression that no longer resembled the distant composure of a ruler addressing a foreign envoy. Instead, there was something searching in her gaze, something almost reflective, as if she were looking not only at the man standing in front of her, but also at the memory of a voice carried across empty space 10 years earlier. "You told me to keep breathing slowly," she said. Her voice was calm, but the softness in it carried across the hall more clearly than any command. "You said that fear makes the mind forget simple things. You said to focus on one task at a time." Ethan felt a faint smile touch the corner of his mouth despite the strange gravity of the room. "That sounds like something I would say," he replied quietly. A faint ripple of confusion moved through the gathered court. The advisors were clearly trying to understand how the Terran diplomat and their queen were speaking as if they had known one another for years. Valeira noticed the reaction but did not look away from Ethan. "During that transmission," she continued, "I asked why you stayed on the channel. Do you remember what you answered?" Ethan searched the memory again. The communications bay had smelled faintly of recycled air and hot circuitry. The clock above the console had crept past midnight, while the distant voice slowly regained its confidence. He remembered leaning back in his chair, headset slightly crooked, trying to sound more certain than he actually felt. The answer returned to him clearly now. "I said that someone had to stay on the line," Ethan replied. The queen nodded once. "Yes, that is what you said." Her silver eyes brightened slightly in the glow of the chamber lights. "Where I come from, that promise carries weight. A voice that refuses to abandon another in the dark becomes something more than a stranger." Ethan shifted his stance slightly, aware that the entire court was listening to every word. "On Earth we call that basic decency," he said. "Someone asked for help. I answered." A faint murmur moved through the hall again, though this time the tone was different. Less suspicion, more curiosity. Valeira slowly turned her head, finally acknowledging the presence of her advisors and the gathered court. For a moment, she seemed to consider the hundreds of watching eyes before returning her attention to Ethan. "You arrived today to prevent a war," she said. "Did you know whose empire you were negotiating with?" Ethan shook his head gently. The briefings explained the political situation. They did not mention anything about a rescue transmission from 10 years ago. The Queen studied him for another long moment. Then, very slowly, the corners of her mouth lifted in the faintest suggestion of a smile. It was not a royal gesture meant for an audience. It was something quieter, something almost private. Then perhaps fate has a sense of timing, she said. Ethan glanced briefly toward the towering windows that overlooked the endless field of waiting ships beyond the station. Somewhere out there, Terran and Valor fleets waited for a signal that could determine the future of two civilizations. He looked back at the Queen standing only a few feet away and felt a strange certainty settle into his thoughts. The peace negotiation had begun long before he stepped into this hall. It had started the moment two strangers refused to let silence win across the distance of space. For a moment neither of them spoke again, and the quiet inside the hall stretched long enough that Ethan became aware of every small sound around him. The low hum of the station rotating nearly 200 miles above the planet below. The faint whisper of translators recalibrating as they processed unfamiliar emotional tones. Even the distant vibration of starships waiting in silent formation outside the massive windows. The entire galaxy felt as if it were paused between two heartbeats. Ethan slowly folded his hands behind his back, partly because protocol demanded composure and partly because it gave him something steady to focus on. 10 years ago, he had been sitting in a cramped communications bay wearing a faded headset and drinking bad station coffee. Now he was standing in the throne chamber of an alien empire speaking with the ruler of that same empire as if they had shared a conversation yesterday. The scale of the moment was almost absurd. Queen Valira seemed to sense the same strange shift in perspective. She turned slightly, glancing at the advisors arranged along the sides of the chamber. Their expressions had moved from confusion to cautious concern. They were watching their ruler speak to a Terran diplomat with an ease that no briefing document had prepared them for. Valira lifted one hand in a small gesture that carried more authority than any shouted command. Instantly, the murmuring quieted. The hall obeyed her without hesitation. She then looked back at Ethan, and the private tone returned to her voice. "Tell me something, Ethan Cole," she said. Hearing his full name spoken by the queen of an alien empire still felt strange. "During that night, when you answered the channel, you did not know who I was." "That is correct," Ethan replied calmly. "You did not know my species, my rank, or my position." "Also correct." Valira tilted her head slightly. "Then why did you remain for 6 hours?" Ethan considered the question for a moment. It was not one he had expected to answer in a royal court. Yet the memory itself was simple. "Because the voice on the other end of the channel sounded alone," he said. The translators repeated his words across the chamber, and a faint ripple of reaction passed through the gathered court again. Ethan continued before anyone else could interrupt the quiet honesty of the moment. "In communications training, we are taught that a signal is never just data. It is a person, someone who chose to speak instead of surrendering to silence. Once you hear that voice, leaving the frequency becomes harder than staying." Valira studied him as if measuring every word. Slowly she began to walk again, moving past him in a slow circle that kept the distance between them respectful but close enough for conversation. Her ceremonial cloak shifted softly with each step, catching the chamber lights like ripples across deep water. "In my culture," she said, "a voice that remains during uncertainty becomes a bond. Not a political one, a personal one." Ethan turned slightly so that he could continue facing her. "I did not realize our conversation carried that kind of meaning." The queen stopped again, now standing beside him rather than in front of him, both of them looking toward the vast windows where the distant fleets waited in silent orbit. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly enough that the translators barely caught the tone. "For 10 years I remembered the calm in that voice," she said. "And today that same voice walked into my throne room asking for peace." Ethan followed her gaze toward the stars. Somewhere beyond those lights, thousands of people waited for a decision that could reshape the future. He felt a small, thoughtful breath escape his chest. "Sometimes peace starts in unexpected places," he said. Valira glanced at him again, and the faint smile returned, thoughtful and almost amused. "Yes," she said softly. "Sometimes it begins with someone who refuses to leave the channel." The view beyond the towering windows seemed even larger now that the first shock of recognition had passed. Ethan stood beside Queen Valara at the edge of the royal platform, both of them facing the quiet sea of distant ships suspended against the black of space. The fleets were spread across the orbit like silent constellations, hundreds of miles apart, yet tied together by the same fragile tension. Every captain out there was waiting for a signal. Ethan could almost imagine the bridge crews watching their monitors, checking the same coordinates again and again, wondering whether diplomacy would succeed or fail before the next rotation of the station. The strange part was that the conversation inside the throne hall had shifted the atmosphere in a way none of the diplomats had predicted. 10 minutes earlier, the chamber had felt like the edge of a cliff. Now it felt more like the beginning of a story no one else in the room understood yet. Queen Valara rested one hand lightly against the transparent crystal wall beside the windows, her silver eyes following the slow drift of the stars. When she spoke again, her voice carried a thoughtful calm that contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding the fleets outside. "There is something you should know," she said. Ethan turned slightly toward her. "I am listening." The queen remained quiet for a moment, as if organizing memories that had been sealed away for a long time. "When that transmission happened 10 years ago," she continued, "I was not yet the ruler of this empire. I was the youngest daughter of the royal house. My ship had been sent on a routine diplomatic route through an unstable region of space." Ethan nodded slowly. The picture was forming more clearly now. A young royal traveling quietly through the outer corridors of a vast empire. A communications signal barely strong enough to reach a distant Terran relay station. "You said very little about yourself during that conversation," Ethan said. "You only asked questions about the navigation system and how to keep the ship stable." Valara allowed a faint, reflective smile. "That was intentional." She turned to face him fully again. "At the time, I had reason to believe that certain people within my own government preferred that my journey end quietly in that region of space." Ethan absorbed that information carefully. The statement was delivered without anger or drama, simply as a matter of fact. The advisors in the hall shifted again at those words, clearly uncomfortable hearing their queen speak so openly about the past. Ethan kept his tone steady. "So the rescue channel was not only about survival. It was also about secrecy." "Exactly," Valara replied. "The fewer identities revealed, the safer the signal remained." Ethan looked out toward the silent fleets again and considered the strange chain of events that had connected them. A single communications officer on a remote Terran station had answered a weak signal from an unknown pilot. That pilot had later become the ruler of an interstellar empire. And now the same two people were standing together while entire civilizations waited outside their windows. "I should probably apologize," Ethan said quietly. The queen raised an eyebrow slightly. "For what?" "For ending my shift," he replied with a small shrug. Apparently, it created a decade of unanswered questions. Valara studied him for a second before a quiet laugh escaped her, soft but unmistakably genuine. The sound surprised several advisors nearby. "You misunderstand," she said. The questions were not unpleasant. Ethan tilted his head slightly. No, Valara answered, her silver eyes returning to the stars. "They reminded me that somewhere in the universe there was a voice willing to remain when everything else became uncertain." She paused briefly, then looked back at him again with a thoughtful expression. "Today that same voice has returned, asking for peace between our worlds." Ethan followed her gaze outward once more. The fleets waited in patient silence. Then, "Perhaps we should make sure the signal does not disappear this time," he said quietly. The quiet after Ethan's words lingered longer than anyone in the chamber expected. Outside the vast crystal windows, the fleets continued their slow orbital drift, starships gliding across the darkness like silent cities of light. Somewhere within those vessels, thousands of people watched their instruments, waiting for instructions that had not yet come. Inside the throne hall, the atmosphere had shifted again, though most of the advisors could not yet name the reason. Ethan remained beside Queen Valara, aware that the distance between them was now less than 6 feet, yet the moment felt far larger than the physical space allowed. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then the queen drew a slow breath and turned slightly toward the enormous chamber behind them. Her advisors were still watching carefully, their expressions caught between curiosity and unease. The entire court had witnessed the strange familiarity between their ruler and the Terran envoy, and none of them had expected diplomacy to unfold like this. Veilira lifted her hand again, not in command but in quiet reassurance. "Leave us," she said calmly. The translators echoed the instruction in several languages. The advisors hesitated only a moment before bowing their heads and stepping back. The guards followed protocol without question, retreating to the far edges of the chamber. Within less than a minute the vast hall had emptied until only two figures remained beneath the glowing arches of crystal. The silence that followed felt different now. Private. Veilira turned back toward Ethan and studied him again, her silver eyes reflecting the faint constellations beyond the glass. 10 years, she said softly. I imagined that voice many times during those years. I wondered who it belonged to. I wondered whether you ever knew what happened after the signal vanished. Ethan folded his arms loosely across his chest, the posture more relaxed now that the court had departed. Honestly, he replied, I assumed the ship made it safely somewhere beyond our relay range. I never expected the story to continue all the way here. Veilira gave a thoughtful nod. It did continue, in ways neither of us could have predicted. She walked slowly toward the center of the hall, her cloak brushing softly across the polished floor. Ethan followed a few steps behind, listening carefully as she spoke. When my ship finally reached the nearest Veiler station that night, the officials there believed I had simply completed a difficult journey. I did not tell them about the Terran signal that helped guide me. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. Why not? The Queen paused near the center of the chamber and turned back toward him. Because I did not know who might be listening. The answer carried a quiet weight. Ethan understood immediately. Even 10 years later she spoke about that night with careful precision, as if certain details were still not meant for everyone's ears. So the story remained unfinished, he said. For both of us. Veilira studied him with the same calm intensity she had shown since he arrived. Yes, she replied. And unfinished stories tend to remain in the mind. Ethan glanced briefly toward the towering windows again. The distant ships were still there, patient and silent. The universe outside had not paused just because two people had rediscovered an old conversation. Eventually the fleets would demand answers. Ethan returned his attention to the Queen. Then perhaps we should finish the conversation properly this time, he said. Veilira considered that suggestion for a moment before a quiet warmth returned to her expression. Perhaps we should, she agreed. And for the first time since Ethan stepped into the throne hall, the future of two civilizations felt slightly less uncertain. The vast chamber felt different now that the court had left. Without the quiet rustle of advisors and the polished discipline of the royal guard, the throne hall seemed almost like a cathedral of light and glass floating in space. Ethan walked slowly beside Queen Veilira across the polished crystal floor, their footsteps echoing softly beneath arches that rose nearly 100 feet overhead. Outside the windows the fleets remained where they had been before, patient and silent, like watchers who understood that something important was unfolding inside the station. Ethan had spent years negotiating treaties and resolving disputes between governments that barely trusted one another, but none of those meetings had ever begun with the discovery of a 10-year-old connection between two strangers. It made the entire situation feel strangely personal. Veilira stopped near the center of the chamber again and rested her hands lightly behind her back, her posture relaxed in a way that a ruler rarely allowed in public. There is something else you should understand about that night, she said. Ethan nodded. Go on. The Queen's silver eyes reflected the distant starlight as she spoke. Among my people, a voice carries more meaning than you might expect. Our language developed long before written symbols existed, long before starships or cities. Identity was recognized through sound, through tone, through the rhythm of breath. Ethan listened carefully, sensing that this explanation carried more than simple cultural detail. So you remember voices the way humans remember faces, he said. Veilira inclined her head slightly. Exactly. When someone speaks to you during a moment of uncertainty, the memory of that voice becomes very difficult to forget. Ethan looked toward the distant ships again, then back to her. And you remembered mine. The Queen's expression softened just slightly. For 10 years. Ethan let out a quiet breath. That is impressive considering the signal quality we were dealing with. Veilira smiled faintly. The signal was distorted. The meaning was not. For a moment the hall was silent again. Ethan found himself remembering small fragments of that long shift in the communications bay. The flicker of the old console lights. The steady repetition of instructions he had given without thinking too deeply about them at the time. Maintain power to navigation. Adjust the thrusters in small increments. Focus on breathing slowly. He had spoken those words simply to keep the unknown pilot calm. Now those same words had returned to him across an entire decade. When you disappeared from the channel, Veolyra continued quietly. I spent the rest of the journey wondering if I had imagined the entire conversation. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Imagined it. She nodded slightly. The universe can be very quiet in deep space. A voice arriving exactly when you need it most can feel almost unreal. Ethan considered that for a moment before giving a small shrug. Well, I can confirm that I was definitely real. The Queen laughed softly, the sound echoing gently through the empty hall. It was a quiet moment, almost ordinary, yet the scale of everything around them made it feel extraordinary. After a moment, Veolyra looked toward the massive windows again, where the waiting fleets hovered like distant constellations. You came here today to negotiate peace between our people, she said. Yes, Ethan replied. She studied the ships for a moment before speaking again. Then perhaps the universe arranged this meeting for a reason. Ethan followed her gaze toward the stars and felt a calm certainty settle in his mind. 10 years ago, he had answered a single call on an emergency frequency. Today, that same call had returned, standing beside him in the form of an alien queen who remembered every word. If the universe arranged it, he said quietly, then we should probably make good use of the opportunity. For several long seconds, the throne hall remained perfectly still, as if the station itself were listening to the quiet conversation unfolding beneath its crystal arches. Ethan stood beside Queen Veolyra while the distant fleets continued their silent orbit beyond the immense windows. The stars looked calm from this distance, but both of them understood how fragile the situation truly was. Hundreds of ships, thousands of lives, and the future of two civilizations all waited for decisions that had not yet been spoken aloud. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the polished railing near the viewing wall and studied the distant lights. It is strange, he said quietly. 10 years ago, we were just two voices on a damaged signal. Now entire governments are waiting to hear what we say next. Veolyra followed his gaze toward the fleets, her expression thoughtful rather than tense. Power often grows quietly from small moments, she replied. A conversation, a promise, a voice that refuses to vanish. Ethan nodded slowly, but before he could respond, a subtle tone echoed through the chamber. It was soft but unmistakable, the controlled signal of a private communication request from the station's command systems. Veolyra's eyes shifted toward the far wall where a narrow band of light appeared across the crystal surface. The station intelligence was requesting permission to deliver a message. The Queen watched the signal for a moment before raising her hand in approval. The glowing line widened into a holographic display that hovered gently above the floor. A calm mechanical voice filled the chamber. Your Majesty, incoming diplomatic transmission from the Velar Defense Council. Ethan noticed the change in Veolyra's posture immediately. The warmth of their private conversation remained in her expression, but the ruler of an empire had returned to the surface of her voice. Display the message, she said. The holographic image resolved into the figure of a tall Velar officer wearing the dark silver uniform of the Defense Council. His posture was precise, his tone respectful but urgent. Your Majesty, the officer said, our observation vessels report that several commanders within the Outer Fleet are requesting confirmation regarding the Terran envoy currently present in the royal chamber. Ethan crossed his arms lightly, already sensing where this conversation was heading. The officer continued. There is concern that the envoy's presence here may influence the negotiations beyond the boundaries agreed upon by the Council. Veolyra listened without interrupting, her expression calm but unreadable. The officer hesitated briefly before adding the final line. Several council members have requested that the Terran representative remain under observation until the diplomatic terms are clarified. The holographic image faded as the transmission ended. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before. Ethan exhaled slowly. Observation, he repeated. That is a polite way of saying they do not trust me. Veilira did not immediately reply. She stepped closer to the viewing wall again, looking out across the distant fleet formations. The faint reflection of the starships shimmered across her sapphire skin. After a moment she spoke softly. Trust is rarely granted quickly during moments like this. Ethan considered that, then gave a small nod. Fair point. The queen turned toward him again, her silver eyes thoughtful. However, she said, there is a difference between caution and misunderstanding. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. And which one is this? Veilira's faint smile returned, though there was a sharper determination behind it now. That, she said calmly, is something we are about to find out. The quiet after the transmission lingered like a low vibration in the vast chamber. Ethan could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from hundreds of miles away through sensor feeds and diplomatic channels. Somewhere in the orbiting fleet, commanders were discussing him, analyzing every detail of his presence here, measuring risk against opportunity. He had experienced that kind of scrutiny before. Diplomacy often meant standing in the middle of other people's doubts. Still, this time felt different. Because 10 years ago he had been nothing more than a voice on a fragile signal, and now that same voice had become a point of tension between entire governments. Ethan shifted his stance slightly and looked toward Queen Veilira. She had not moved from the viewing wall. The distant light of the fleets shimmered across the reflective crystal beside her, outlining her silhouette against the stars. For a moment, she seemed less like the ruler of an empire and more like someone considering a very personal decision. You should probably respond to them, Ethan said calmly. If your defense counsel believes I am a complication, ignoring the concern will only make it worse. Veilira turned her head slightly, studying him with quiet interest. You are suggesting that I follow their request. Ethan shrugged lightly. I am suggesting that diplomacy works best when everyone believes they have been heard. The queen walked slowly back toward the center of the hall, the soft echo of her footsteps returning to the chamber now that the advisors were gone. She stopped a few feet away from him and folded her hands behind her back. Observation, she said thoughtfully. They want the Terran envoy placed under formal monitoring while negotiations continue. Ethan nodded once. That is not unusual. It happens during high-tension talks. Veilira tilted her head slightly. And you would accept that condition. Ethan let out a small breath and glanced once more toward the immense windows where the fleets remained suspended in patient silence. If it helps keep two civilizations from drifting closer to conflict, then yes. The answer seemed to surprise her slightly. Ethan noticed the faint change in her expression. You expected resistance, he added. Veilira gave a small nod. Most envoys would see it as an insult. Ethan smiled faintly. Most envoys did not accidentally guide the future queen of an empire through deep space during a communications shift. The remark earned a quiet laugh from her, though the thoughtful look in her eyes remained. She turned slightly and activated the station display again with a subtle gesture. The holographic console returned to life in front of them. Station intelligence, Veilira said calmly. Prepare a response to the Defense Council. A soft chime acknowledged the command. The Queen glanced at Ethan one more time before continuing. Inform them that the Terran envoy will remain within the diplomatic wing of the station during the next phase of negotiations. Ethan listened carefully. The arrangement sounded reasonable enough. Then Veilira added the final line. And inform them that the envoy will remain under my personal supervision. Ethan blinked once in mild surprise. That is not exactly what they asked for. The Queen's faint smile returned, calm and confident. No, she said softly, but it is what they will receive. Ethan looked at her for a moment before letting out a quiet breath of amusement. The situation outside the station had not changed. The fleet still waited. The government still watched. But suddenly the negotiations felt less like a formal standoff and more like the continuation of a conversation that had started 10 years earlier across a damaged signal in deep space. The holographic console dimmed after transmitting the Queen's reply, leaving the chamber bathed once again in the soft blue light of the crystal arches. Ethan watched the fading glow for a moment, imagining the signal racing across the station and out toward the distant command vessels where the Defense Council would receive it. Somewhere within those ships, officers would now be reading a message that both satisfied and complicated their request. Observation had been granted, but not in the way they expected. Ethan turned toward Queen Veilira with a thoughtful expression. Your council is going to have opinions about that response, he said calmly. Veolira did not appear concerned. She stepped away from the console and began walking slowly toward the viewing wall again, her posture composed and deliberate. They always do, she replied. Ethan followed a few steps behind her, noticing how naturally she carried the weight of authority, the quiet confidence of someone who understood both the expectations and the limits of power. When they reached the immense windows again, the fleets outside seemed almost closer now, their distant navigation lights drifting like patient stars across the darkness. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the railing beside the glass and studied the formations. Do they trust your judgment? He asked after a moment. Or do they simply respect your position? Veolira considered the question carefully before answering. Both, she said. And sometimes neither. Ethan smiled faintly at that. Sounds familiar. For several seconds they watched the silent fleets together. Then the Queen spoke again, her voice carrying the calm tone of someone revealing a truth she had already accepted. Leadership often means making decisions before everyone agrees with them, she said. Ethan nodded slowly. On Earth we usually call that responsibility. Veolira turned toward him, her silver eyes thoughtful. And sometimes responsibility means protecting opportunities that others do not yet understand. Ethan recognized the meaning behind the statement immediately. The Defense Council saw him as a diplomatic variable that needed monitoring. Veolira saw him as something else entirely. A connection that existed long before this negotiation began. You believe our meeting here matters beyond politics, Ethan said. The Queen held his gaze steadily. Yes. Ethan let out a slow breath. The honesty in her answer carried a quiet gravity. 10 years ago, he had simply answered a weak emergency signal during a routine shift. He had not expected that decision to echo across an entire decade and reappear inside the throne chamber of an alien empire. Yet here it was, shaping conversations that could determine the future of two civilizations. Veolira turned slightly and looked toward the distant fleet again. The Council sees a Terran envoy who may influence negotiations, she said. I see the person who reminded me that cooperation between our worlds was possible long before our governments acknowledged it. Ethan leaned lightly against the railing, considering her words. You are giving one old radio conversation a lot of credit. Veolira smiled faintly. Not the conversation, she replied softly. The choice behind it. Ethan glanced toward her. Choice. You chose to remain on the channel, she said. You chose to guide someone you did not know. That kind of decision reveals more about a civilization than any treaty document. The thought lingered between them for a moment. Outside the window, the fleets continued their patient orbit, their commanders waiting for instructions that had not yet arrived. Ethan looked at the distant ships and felt a quiet certainty settle in his mind. Then maybe this negotiation is not about convincing governments, he said. Veolira studied him curiously. What is it about? Ethan met her gaze with a calm smile. Maybe it is about reminding them that the signal between our worlds has already been open for 10 years. The quiet certainty in Ethan's words seemed to linger in the air long after he finished speaking. Queen Veolira did not answer immediately. Instead, she remained beside the crystal railing, her gaze drifting across the vast field of starships suspended outside the station. The fleets were still there, their formation unchanged, their commanders waiting for instructions that had not yet arrived. From this distance, the ships looked calm and patient, but Ethan understood that patience in space was often only the surface of deeper uncertainty. Governments feared what they did not understand, and at the moment both sides were still trying to understand each other. Veolira finally turned away from the window and looked at Ethan again. Her silver eyes reflected the faint glow of the stars behind him. 10 years, she said thoughtfully. A single conversation carried across an emergency channel. And now that same conversation stands between two civilizations deciding whether they will become allies or rivals. Ethan leaned lightly against the railing, considering the scale of what she had just said. It is strange how often history begins with something small, he replied. Veolira walked slowly toward the center of the chamber again, the long sweep of her cloak moving softly across the polished floor. Ethan followed at an easy pace. The chamber felt even larger now that the court had left earlier, its towering crystal arches glowing faintly above them like the inside of a quiet observatory. When the queen stopped near the center of the hall, she turned toward him with the calm composure of someone who had made a decision. My council will contact us again soon, she said. They will expect a formal progress report on the negotiations. Ethan nodded once. That makes sense. Veilira studied him carefully. And they will also expect evidence that the Terran envoy under observation is cooperating with the diplomatic process. Ethan gave a faint smile. I am fairly certain that standing peacefully inside your throne hall qualifies as cooperation. The queen allowed herself a brief laugh before her expression became thoughtful again. Yes, but diplomacy often requires more visible symbols than quiet conversations. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You have something specific in mind. Veilira walked toward the central platform where the royal throne still stood beneath the glowing arches. When she reached it, she rested her hand lightly against the edge of the stone structure, looking back toward Ethan with a calm and deliberate expression. The council believes you are a variable in this negotiation, she said. Something that must be watched carefully. Ethan folded his arms loosely. That sounds accurate from their perspective. Veilira nodded once. Then perhaps we should give them something clearer to observe. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. And what would that be? The queen met his gaze with steady confidence. A demonstration that cooperation between our worlds is not a theoretical concept. Ethan considered her words for a moment. The idea forming behind them was beginning to make sense. You are suggesting a public step, he said slowly. Veilira inclined her head. Exactly. She turned slightly and gestured toward the immense viewing wall where the fleets waited beyond the glass. Both sides are watching this station. Terran command vessels. Valar defense cruisers. Every sensor and communication relay is focused on this place. Ethan followed her gaze toward the distant ships again. The implication became clear almost immediately. You want them to see something that changes the narrative, he said. Veilira's faint smile returned. Yes. Ethan let out a thoughtful breath. 10 years ago, he had spoken to an unknown voice across a fragile signal. Now that same connection was about to become visible to an entire fleet. Then the question becomes simple, he said calmly. Veilira looked at him with quiet curiosity. What question? Ethan met her gaze steadily. What kind of signal do we want them to receive? The question hung in the air between them like the final note of a long conversation. What kind of signal do we want them to receive? Ethan and Queen Veilira stood beneath the high crystal arches of the throne hall, while the distant fleets continued their slow, silent orbit beyond the massive windows. Hundreds of ships, thousands of lives, entire civilizations watching the same station from opposite sides of uncertainty. The answer they chose in this room would travel across every communication channel in the system within minutes. Veilira did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked toward the viewing wall again, her reflection moving beside the quiet stars. Ethan followed her with unhurried steps until they stood once more beside the transparent crystal barrier that overlooked the fleets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the ships. Some were Terran vessels, their angular hulls illuminated by steady white navigation lights. Others were Valar cruisers, their curved designs glowing faintly with blue energy along their outer frames. From this distance, they looked almost peaceful together, as if the emptiness of space had already forgotten the tension that brought them here. Veilira finally turned toward Ethan, her silver eyes calm and steady. When two people speak across a broken signal, she said softly, they do not see each other. They do not know who stands on the other end. All they know is the voice that answers. Ethan nodded slowly. He remembered that night clearly now. The static in his headset. The careful rhythm of instructions. The determination in a voice that refused to give up even when the signal weakened. Trust begins with a voice, he said quietly. Veilira inclined her head slightly. Yes. She lifted her hand and activated the station communication interface built into the viewing wall. A wide holographic display unfolded across the crystal surface, its light reflecting across the chamber like a pale sunrise. Ethan immediately recognized the scale of what she had just done. The system she had opened was not a private diplomatic channel. It was the primary broadcast relay of the station. Every vessel within range would receive whatever signal passed through it. Veilira looked at him once more before speaking. 10 years ago, a Terran voice answered a call that did not belong to his people, she said calmly. Today that same voice stands here asking for peace between our worlds. Ethan understood what she was doing. She was turning a private memory into a public message, a signal that every captain and council member would hear. Veolyra turned toward the holographic console and spoke clearly. This is Queen Veolyra of the Valar Empire. To all command vessels currently observing this station. Her voice carried across the chamber and into the vast communication network beyond it. Ethan could almost imagine the bridge crews and distant ships looking up from their consoles as the transmission reached them. The Queen continued. 10 years ago my life was guided safely through deep space by a voice that belonged to a Terran officer I had never met. That voice refused to abandon the channel even when the signal was weak. Ethan felt a quiet weight settle in his chest as he listened. Veolyra turned toward him and extended her hand in a simple gesture that required no explanation. Ethan looked at her for a brief moment before accepting the gesture with calm confidence. The contact was steady and deliberate. Two representatives of distant worlds standing together in full view of every watching fleet. Veolyra faced the transmission display again. Today that same voice has come to this station asking for peace, she said. The Valar Empire will answer that call the same way it was answered before. Ethan glanced toward the endless field of ships outside the window. Somewhere out there hundreds of commanders were watching the signal that now connected their worlds. Veolyra's final words traveled outward through every communication relay in the system. We will remain on the channel. The stars beyond the glass remained silent, but the signal had already begun its journey across the distance between two civilizations.